Sergeant Mia Jackson wasn't looking for trouble. She was just trying to report for duty. But the moment she stepped out of her car in full uniform at a quiet gas station in Gahanna, Ohio, all hell broke loose. Within seconds, she was swarmed, slammed against her own hood, and handcuffed like a criminal, while strangers filmed her humiliation. Her crime? Wearing the uniform she earned, carrying the ID she fought for, and still, they called her a fraud. What should have been a routine stop turned into a public spectacle of disrespect, disbelief, and disgrace. But that wasn't the end. It was the beginning. The video exploded, the outrage ignited, and the silence she stood in became the roar of a movement. She didn't scream. She didn't fight. She didn't have to. Her stillness was louder than violence, her dignity unshakable, and her story a brutal reminder that even heroes get handcuffed when ignorance wears a badge. She didn't ask to lead, but someone followed, then thousands, then millions. Now it's your turn. Where in the world are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments. Let your voice be heard. The cold metal dug into her wrists as Sergeant Mia Jackson felt her face pressed against the dusty hood of her own car. The rough grip on her shoulder didn't loosen. She heard the unmistakable sound of a phone camera clicking nearby. Another and another. A man's voice shouted, "Get that angle? Get her face?" Mia didn't move, couldn't move. The early morning sunlight broke through the thin fog over Gahanna, Ohio, painting the small gas station in sharp, unforgiving clarity. A woman in a gray hoodie whispered, Is she in uniform?" Another voice, sharper, cut in, "Don't matter. You see what she looked like?" Mia bit the inside of her cheek, refusing to give them the sound of her breathing shifting. Someone laughed behind her. "Yeah, bet she's one of those stolen valor types. You know how they do." The hand on her shoulder pressed harder as if daring her to flinch. She didn't. She couldn't. She was already calculating, counting. There were at least 6 phones pointed at her now, one officer gripping her shoulder, another pacing somewhere behind. She heard the static of a radio crackling, low and undecipherable, the sound of gas pumps beeping, the unmistakable tension of a crowd that didn't know whether to step closer or back away. Her jaw tightened. She knew how this looked. A black woman, face down in military camouflage, cuffed like a criminal on the hood of a dusty sedan. She wanted to scream that her name was Sergeant Mia Jackson of the 174th Infantry, but she knew better. Her uniform didn't stop them. Maybe nothing ever does. 2 minutes earlier, Mia had swiped her card at pump number 4. The gas flowed as she leaned back against her car, tearing open a protein bar with her teeth. She scrolled through her phone lazily, thumbing past weather alerts and unread messages until her mother's name popped up. "Morning, baby. Call me when you get there. Be safe." Mia smiled without thinking, chewing slowly as she hit reply. "Will do, Mama. Rolling out now." She tucked her phone into the front pocket of her uniform jacket, glanced at her reflection in the dark window of her car, adjusted her rank patch out of habit, and stretched her shoulders. The base was 2 hours away. She had done this drive more times than she could count. She knew the routine. Gas, snacks, go, nothing out of the ordinary. She screwed the gas cap back on, climbed into the driver's seat, and started the engine. But as she adjusted her rearview mirror, she saw it. A patrol car easing into the lot, creeping slow like it had nowhere else to be. Her eyes narrowed. 2 officers, both white, both staring right at her car. Mia's pulse ticked once, then settled. Routine. Stay calm. Nothing to hide. She turned off the engine, stepped out again as if on cue, pretending to double-check the pump, but their car stopped behind hers. No lights, no siren, just a silent wall of presence. Mia turned slowly to face them, hands visible, posture neutral but alert. The driver's door popped open first. The taller officer stepped out, sunglasses low on his nose, one hand resting casually on his belt. The second followed slower, his hand already grazing the latch on his holster. Mia's jaw tightened. She knew the type. The first one spoke, voice too casual to be honest. "Morning. Can I see some ID?" Mia nodded, keeping her voice steady. "Yes, sir. It's in my jacket pocket." She moved slowly, retrieving her military ID and state license, handing them over without a word. He took them, glanced down, then up again with a crooked smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We got a report. Someone matching your description, pretending to be military. You mind stepping over here for me?" Mia's breath caught for half a second. She knew the script, knew better than to argue, but the anger surged anyway, rising like bile in her throat. She swallowed it down. "I am military," she replied, voice firm but level. "My unit's down at—" He cut her off with a wave. "Yeah, sure. Just step over here." She obeyed, moving toward the front of her car. The second officer circled wide, boxing her in. "What's your unit again?" the first one asked. Mia answered, slowly, clearly. 174th Infantry. I'm on reserve duty. I'm en route to base." He hummed like she'd just told him the sky was blue. "Uh-huh." He handed her ID to the second officer without breaking eye contact. "Run it." The second officer stepped back, pulling out his phone like he was doing something official. Mia knew damn well they weren't checking anything. The first officer stepped closer. "Got any other proof on you?" Mia pointed to her car. "My orders are in the glove box." He didn't move. Instead, he nodded to his partner. "Cuff her." Mia stiffened. "Excuse me?" The second officer didn't hesitate. The cold steel closed around her wrists before the question could finish leaving her lips. "You're being detained for questioning," the first officer said, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. Mia's body hit the hood before she could blink. And now, here she was, face pressed to metal, surrounded by strangers holding phones, her dignity bleeding out one snap at a time. The officer leaned in, voice low. "Should have kept driving, soldier." But Mia didn't answer. Her mind was already moving to the only move she had left, because behind her, just past the edge of her blurred vision, that patrol car was still running. And in that car, her phone was sitting unlocked on the passenger seat. One number burned into her speed dial. One name, Colonel James Carter. And this time, the chain of command was about to answer. Officer Kyle Monroe adjusted his sunglasses, stepping back from the hood of Mia's car like he had just completed a routine traffic stop. His hand hovered near his holster, not because he needed to, but because he wanted her to know he could. Officer Frank Dalton stayed a few steps behind, his posture loose, almost uninterested, arms crossed, like this was just another slow Saturday morning. Monroe turned to Dalton and nodded, his voice pitched loud enough for the crowd to hear. "We got an anonymous tip, possible impersonator. She fits the description." Dalton didn't say a word. He didn't need to. His silence gave Monroe all the permission he was looking for. Mia clenched her jaw, feeling the cuff marks already starting to burn into her wrists. She twisted slightly to face Monroe, keeping her voice level. "I showed you my military ID. You have my state license. My orders are in the glove box. I am not impersonating anyone." Monroe smirked like he'd heard this 100 times before. He leaned down closer to her ear. "Funny, that's exactly what someone pretending to be military would say." His words were oily, meant to be heard by the gathering crowd. Mia could hear the whispers rising again, some doubting, some recording, no one stepping in. Dalton shifted his weight but didn't move. His eyes flicked toward Monroe, then back to Mia. He looked like a man who wanted no part of this but wasn't about to interfere either. Mia caught the hesitation in his body language. He wasn't fully committed, but he wasn't stopping it either. Monroe straightened up, turned to face the crowd, and raised his voice as if putting on a show. We've had reports of stolen valor scams in the area. People dressing up like soldiers to get free stuff or scam donations. We take that real serious here." A man in the crowd nodded like Monroe had just solved a murder. Monroe turned back to Mia, lowering his voice again. "So, until we confirm otherwise, you're detained." Mia took a breath, steady and sharp. "What's your probable cause, officer?" she asked, her tone clipped but professional. Monroe chuckled under his breath. "Your attitude is enough for me." Dalton finally shifted, his voice low. "Kyle, maybe we should—" Monroe cut him off with a glance sharp enough to slice. Dalton fell silent again. Monroe grabbed Mia's elbow, pulling her toward the back of the patrol car. The cameras followed. The crowd didn't move, but the air thickened with tension. Mia didn't resist. She walked, stiff and deliberate, letting every step burn a hole into the narrative Monroe was trying to build. As Monroe opened the back door, he leaned in close again, voice dripping with mock concern. "Look, if you're real military, this'll get sorted. If not, well, you made it easy for us." He pushed her head slightly to avoid the door frame, a move that was more performative than necessary. Mia slid into the back seat, cuffs biting deeper into her skin. Dalton shut the door behind her, his face unreadable. Monroe circled back to the driver's side, climbing in like he had just bagged a trophy. He looked over at Dalton through the open window. "You coming or what?" Dalton hesitated for half a second before moving around to the passenger side and climbing in. The car door slammed shut, muting the noise from the crowd outside. Inside the car, Mia's breathing slowed. She shifted slightly, feeling the vibration of her phone still on the passenger seat where she had left it. The screen was dim, but she knew the number was ready to dial. Colonel James Carter. She had one shot to get this right. Mia leaned forward as much as the cuffs would allow, tilting her head to catch Dalton's reflection in the rearview mirror. He wasn't looking at her. Good. She shifted her weight again, inching her hands as low as she could manage behind her back. The cuffs clinked softly, but the officers didn't seem to notice. Her fingers stretched, fumbling blindly for the edge of the seat. There. She hooked her thumb under the seatbelt buckle, pulling herself just close enough to tap the corner of her phone with her knuckle. The screen lit up. One touch. That was all she needed. Mia tilted her wrist again, pressing the speed dial she had programmed months ago, never thinking she'd actually need it. The call connected instantly. She couldn't bring the phone to her ear, but she didn't have to. She spoke low, clear, knowing every word would be recorded on the other end. "This is Sergeant Mia Jackson, badge number 174J. I'm detained in a patrol car outside the BP on Hamilton Road in Gahanna. Officers are Monroe and Dalton. No charges, no explanation. Request immediate chain of command contact. Copy?" She paused just long enough to hear the breath on the other end. Colonel James Carter didn't waste words. His voice cut through the static like a blade. "Copy. Stay calm. Stay visible. We're coming." Mia ended the call with her knuckle, letting the phone slip back onto the seat. She leaned back against the vinyl cushion, steadying her breathing. She could feel the weight of the moment shifting, tilting the balance away from Monroe's smug control. The chain of command was moving now. But even before backup arrived, something outside the car caught Mia's attention. The crowd had shifted. Someone was moving through the people, pushing past phones and whispers. A voice rose above the noise, sharp and familiar, cutting through the fog of doubt. A woman's voice, filled with something heavier than outrage. Recognition. "Mia? Is that you?" Mia turned her head toward the window, her pulse kicking up again. Someone had seen her. Someone who knew exactly who she was, and they were not staying silent. Colonel James Carter was already awake when the call came through. He always was. Years of military habit kept his body clock sharp, even on weekends when the rest of the base moved slower. He stood in his office at Fort Granger, coffee going cold on his desk, staring out the window at the training field where the first wave of recruits had just begun their morning drills. His phone buzzed once, then again, a number flashing that he had assigned to only one person, Mia Jackson. Carter answered before the second ring could finish. He heard her voice, low and steady, like every field report she had ever given him. Clear, controlled, coded. It took him 3 seconds to process every detail. A traffic stop in Gahanna, 2 local officers. No charges, no cause. Uniformed soldier detained without explanation. His grip on the phone tightened. Copy. Stay calm. Stay visible. We're coming. He hung up before she could say anything else. Carter didn't need more details. He had heard enough. He moved quickly to his desk, sliding open the bottom drawer to pull out the contact sheet marked Emergency Communications, Civilian Agencies. His finger ran down the list until it landed on the direct line for the Gahanna Police Department's watch commander. He dialed without hesitation. The phone rang twice before someone picked up, a voice on the other end sounding half asleep. Carter didn't waste time. "This is Colonel James Carter, Fort Granger Command. I need to speak to your watch commander immediately. This is a military matter." The voice on the other end stammered something about checking availability, but Carter cut in. "Now, not later, now." The line went silent for a moment before another voice took over, this one sharper, trying to sound in control. "Commander Rogers speaking. What's the issue?" Carter didn't flinch. "2 of your officers, Monroe and Dalton, have detained one of my soldiers in full uniform at the BP station on Hamilton Road. No charges, no explanation. I want confirmation of their position and status immediately, and I want it logged." The line crackled slightly as Rogers shifted. "Colonel, if this is a civilian stop, Carter cut him off again. "Your officers just placed military personnel under detainment without cause. You have 5 minutes to verify their actions and report back to me directly." Rogers exhaled slowly. "Understood. I'll check." Carter didn't hang up. He put the call on hold and immediately sent a coded message through the internal base system, flagging the incident as a potential violation of the Soldier and Sailor Protection Act. Within seconds, alerts pinged through the chain of command. His second-in-command, Major Angela Reed, appeared in his doorway, already halfway into uniform. "I saw the flag. What's the situation?" Carter didn't look up from the comms terminal. "Mia Jackson, cuffed in public. Local PD. Reed's jaw tensed. You want me to prep a team?" Carter nodded once. "Get Brooks on the ground. Quiet, but visible. I want eyes on her in 5 minutes." Reed didn't waste a second. Carter returned to the call on hold. Rogers was back, his tone different now. "Colonel, I've confirmed Monroe and Dalton are on scene. They reported a suspected stolen valor case. They claim the subject couldn't verify identity." Carter's voice turned cold. "My soldier provided military ID, state license, and travel orders. Your officers had no legal standing to detain her." Rogers tried to recover. "Sir, we're following protocol." Carter didn't let him finish. "Your protocol is about to become a federal issue. Stand down your officers or escalate this into a jurisdictional crisis. Your call." The silence stretched just long enough for Carter to know Rogers was weighing the fallout. Finally, the commander replied, quieter this time, "I'll contact them now." Carter ended the call without another word. He turned to Reed, who had already pulled up traffic cams in the area. She pointed to one feed showing a growing crowd at the gas station. "It's already public. Phones are up. Cameras are rolling." Carter rubbed a hand over his jaw. "Contact the city council liaison. I want the mayor on record before this spins out." Reed nodded, already drafting the message. Carter stood, grabbing his coat. "I'm heading out. Keep me updated every 60 seconds. Meanwhile, back at the gas station, Monroe shifted uncomfortably in the driver's seat of the patrol car. Dalton kept glancing in the side mirror, watching the crowd thicken. The woman in the gray hoodie had stepped closer, her phone still raised. Monroe muttered under his breath, "They always play the hero card when people start recording." Dalton didn't respond. His jaw was tight, his knuckles pale on the door handle. Mia watched them both through the barrier glass, reading every flicker of hesitation on Dalton's face. She leaned back, pressing her cuffed wrists deeper into the seat behind her. She didn't need to say a word. The wheels had already started turning. Outside, the air shifted again. A voice rang out, cutting through the noise like a blade. "Mia? Mia Jackson?" The crowd parted slightly as a woman pushed her way to the front. Patrice Ellis. Mia recognized her immediately. The last time they had seen each other, Mia had been pulling Patrice out of a collapsed highway median during last year's flood response. Patrice's voice shook with something between shock and fury. "That's her. That's Sergeant Jackson. She saved lives during the flood." Monroe flinched like he'd been slapped. Dalton turned fully in his seat now, staring out the window as the crowd leaned in closer. Phones lifted higher. Whispers turned to murmurs. Patrice wasn't backing down. She took another step forward, pointing directly at the officers. "What are you doing? She's a soldier. She's a hero." Mia held her breath as the tension outside the car broke wide open. This was no longer just about her. The crowd had found its voice. And the officers, they were running out of places to hide. Patrice Ellis pushed her way through the circle of onlookers, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew that face, knew that uniform, and every part of her was screaming to do something before this got any worse. She had stayed silent once before in her life, years ago when someone she cared about had been humiliated by police in front of her. She had promised herself that would never happen again. And here she was, watching the woman who had once saved her life being paraded like a criminal in front of a crowd that didn't seem to know what they were seeing. Patrice didn't hesitate. She cupped her hands around her mouth and shouted, "That's Sergeant Mia Jackson. She's not faking anything. She's a real soldier. She saved people in the floods last year. She saved me." The crowd shifted as her words cut through the air. Some people lowered their phones for just a second, glancing at each other, processing what they had just heard. A few turned their cameras back on, angling them toward Patrice now, their curiosity morphing into something heavier. The name Mia Jackson began to ripple through the group like a spark searching for dry timber. Monroe stepped out of the patrol car, slamming the door behind him. He pointed at Patrice, his voice sharp. "Ma'am, step back. This doesn't concern you." Patrice didn't flinch. She stepped closer, her voice rising. "The hell it doesn't. You got the wrong woman and everyone here knows it now." Dalton exited slower, scanning the faces in the crowd. His jaw clenched as more people raised their phones again, recording every word, every move. Monroe took a step toward Patrice, hand reaching for the radio on his shoulder. "I said step back." Patrice's eyes burned. "Or what? You'll cuff me too? Go ahead. See how far that gets you." Someone in the back of the crowd started chanting, "Let her go! Let her go!" Another voice picked it up, and another. The chant grew louder, swelling into a rhythm that couldn't be ignored. Monroe's face darkened. He turned back toward the car, yanking the door open again to glare at Mia. "You started this circus," he hissed under his breath. Mia didn't answer. She didn't need to. The noise outside was answering for her. Patrice wasn't done. She turned to face the crowd fully, raising her voice like she had done it 100 times before. "This woman pulled me out of the water when my car flipped during the flood. I was trapped. No one else could reach me. She waded through all that debris, risked her own life, and pulled me out. I know her. She's a hero. You all need to see what they're doing to her now." More phones lifted. People pushed closer. The circle around the patrol car tightened. Monroe barked into his radio, calling for backup, but the tension was already boiling past the point of control. Dalton stood frozen, his face betraying the cracks forming under the pressure. One woman near the front whispered loudly, "Isn't that the soldier from Channel 6 last year? The one they interviewed after the rescue?" Another man nodded, scrolling on his phone. "It's her. I remember now. That's her." Patrice pointed again, her voice trembling but fierce. "She saved lives, and now they're trying to erase hers." Monroe turned toward the crowd, lifting both hands in an attempt to calm the growing unrest. "Everyone back up. This is an active investigation. Disperse now or face arrest." But no one moved. Instead, more phones started streaming live. One teenager near the back whispered, "I'm on TikTok live right now. We've got over 1,000 watching already." Another added, "Tag the local news. They need to see this." In the newsroom at WCOL 8 in Columbus, Rachel Kim leaned back in her chair, scrolling through trending hashtags on her monitor. Her phone buzzed on the desk next to her. She glanced down, reading the message from a friend. "You seeing this? BP station in Gahanna. Soldier getting harassed. It's blowing up." Rachel clicked on the link, pulling up a shaky live stream of the scene. She watched as the camera zoomed in on Mia's face, then panned to the officers, then back to the crowd. Her reporter's instinct fired instantly. This wasn't some prank or misunderstanding. This was something bigger. She stood, grabbing her bag and shouting toward the assignment desk. "I'm heading to Gahanna. We've got something breaking." One of the producers called after her. "What is it?" Rachel didn't stop moving. She didn't have time to explain. Not yet. All she knew was this wasn't just another clip floating on the internet. This was a story, and it was moving fast. Back at the gas station, Monroe's radio crackled with static. Reinforcements were on the way, but he knew it wouldn't look good. Not with cameras rolling, not with the crowd growing louder. Dalton shifted uneasily, glancing toward Patrice, then back at Mia, who sat motionless in the back seat, watching it all unfold like she had already seen the ending. Patrice planted her feet, daring Monroe to make the next move. "You better uncuff her before this gets bigger than you can handle." Monroe's jaw worked, chewing on the weight of the moment. But before he could respond, another wave of notifications hit the phones in the crowd. The live stream was spreading faster than anyone expected. Screens flashed with comments. Viewers were tagging news outlets, military accounts, and civil rights organizations. The story was no longer theirs to control. The internet had woken up, and the pressure was about to explode. The newsroom at WCOL 8 in downtown Columbus was rarely this alive at 6 in the morning. Most reporters were still working through coffee and chasing leads that would either fizzle out or turn into slow news cycles no one really cared about. But Rachel Kim wasn't most reporters. She was young, sharp, and known for spotting stories before they exploded. That was exactly what made her swipe pause when the clip landed on her feed. It was grainy, shaky, shot on someone's phone, but there was no mistaking the chaos captured in every frame. A black woman in full military uniform cuffed on the hood of a car, surrounded by police officers and a growing crowd. The hashtag flashing across the screen caught her attention first. Number sign, Gahanna Gas Station. Rachel leaned in, tapping the volume up, listening to the voice of a woman off camera shouting about a flood rescue, about a soldier being humiliated in public. Rachel's pulse picked up. She had seen clips like this before, but something felt different this time. The way the crowd wasn't backing down. The way the officer on screen looked more cornered than in control. She clicked through the comments. The video had barely been up for 10 minutes and already had over 40,000 views. Someone had tagged every news outlet in the state. Others had started pulling up old headlines from last year about a Sergeant Mia Jackson who saved lives during the Reynoldsburg flood. Rachel's instincts screamed louder than the noise in the newsroom. She grabbed her phone, pulling up the police scanner app she kept on standby. She searched for Gahanna. Nothing was listed on official dispatch. That only made her more certain. She turned on her heel, heading straight toward the assignment desk. "I'm heading to Gahanna," she called out, grabbing her press badge and keys. The assignment editor, Jim, barely looked up from his monitor. "What's going on?" Rachel didn't slow down. "Viral video. Soldier detained at a gas station. It's already blowing up." Jim sighed. "You sure it's not just internet noise?" Rachel shot him a look over her shoulder. "It's not. Trust me." She was already out the door before he could argue. Sliding into her car, Rachel pulled the video up again, this time cross-referencing the location with the street signs she caught in the background. Hamilton Road. She knew that stretch. It was just under 30 minutes away if she hit the lights right. She floored it out of the parking lot, ignoring the coffee she left behind on her desk. Halfway there, she started making calls. First to the station's digital team, ordering them to start pulling every clip, every tweet, every thread connected to the hashtag. Then to her contact at the city council, who owed her after she killed a story about his office last year. When he picked up, she didn't waste time. "What do you know about police activity on Hamilton Road this morning?" His pause told her more than his words ever could. "Nothing official." "Why?" Rachel kept her voice tight. "Because the internet says otherwise. Get me a statement. Now." She hung up before he could respond. Rachel's mind raced through the angles. Civil rights, military misconduct, police overreach. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was a story, and it was moving fast. Across town, inside the Gahanna Police Department's Watch Command Room, the atmosphere was anything but calm. Commander Rogers stood over the shoulder of a young communications officer, watching as the viral video replayed on loop across multiple monitors. The comments were brutal, the view count climbing by the second. The department's official social media inbox was already flooded with demands for accountability. Rogers rubbed his temple, pacing the room. Sergeant Bennett, head of internal affairs, leaned against the far wall, arms crossed. "We need to get ahead of this before it blows up any bigger," Bennett said. Rogers turned sharply. "You think I don't know that?" He gestured toward the screen. "Look at that. We're already a damn headline, and none of these people know the full story." Bennett raised an eyebrow. "Do we?" Rogers didn't answer. Instead, he turned to Officer Lang, the department's PR handler. "Draft a statement. Say we're aware of the situation and conducting an internal review." Lang hesitated. "Do you want to include the suspect's name?" Rogers snapped back. "She's not a suspect. Not officially." Bennett pushed off the wall. "You're about to make her one, aren't you?" The tension thickened. Rogers knew exactly what this looked like. A soldier, detained in uniform, humiliated on camera. The public would eat them alive if they didn't control the narrative. He clenched his fists. "Start building a report. Say there were credible complaints of impersonation. Say she refused to cooperate. Make it look clean." Bennett shook his head slowly. "You better be damn sure about that." Rogers leaned in, his voice dropping to a growl. "We don't have a choice. If this spins out, the whole department takes the hit." He turned back to the screen as another wave of comments rolled in. "Get Monroe on the line. Tell him to hold position. Reinforcements are 5 minutes out, and tell him to stick to the script." But outside, on the ground, sticking to the script was already slipping through Monroe's fingers. The crowd had doubled in size. The phones hadn't stopped recording, and somewhere in that sea of strangers, someone else was already feeding new footage to the media. Rachel Kim was almost there, and the narrative Monroe had started writing was about to collapse under the weight of what the cameras had already caught. At the checkpoint on the south side of Gahanna, Officer Kyle Monroe stood next to the mobile command unit with his arms crossed, staring at the monitor that displayed the live feed from the gas station. The department's crisis response team had set up a temporary station after Commander Rogers ordered a perimeter around the scene. Monroe knew the pressure was on. The department was already pushing a public statement, framing the incident as a lawful stop based on a credible impersonation complaint. It was thin, but they all knew the public didn't care about legal nuance. The only thing that mattered now was controlling what the media saw and believed. Monroe kept repeating the lie to himself like a rehearsed script. He glanced toward the open channel on the comms desk and pressed the button to connect with Rogers. Monroe here, holding position. Crowds getting louder, but still manageable. Rogers's voice came through flat. Stick to the statement. Say she refused to verify identity and became confrontational. Do not engage unless you have to. Monroe released the button, rolling his eyes. Refused to verify? He knew that was a stretch. The woman had handed over 2 forms of ID before he ever touched his cuffs, but that detail wouldn't make it into the official report, not if he followed orders. Frank Dalton leaned against the cruiser nearby, arms folded tightly, watching the crowd with growing unease. He had kept quiet the entire time, but the way Monroe carried himself was starting to wear thin. Dalton knew what they had done. He'd watched Monroe ignore the IDs. He had heard him bait the woman, daring her to flinch just so he could justify the cuffs. Dalton rubbed his face, wondering how far this would go before someone higher up shut it down. Inside the mobile unit, Sergeant Bennett reviewed the body cam footage from Monroe and Dalton, looking for anything to support the narrative Rogers had ordered. But the footage was messy. There was no resistance, no raised voice, nothing but a soldier standing her ground and officers pushing her toward the hood of the car. Bennett clicked through the audio logs again, catching a short exchange between Monroe and Dalton that made his stomach turn. Monroe had leaned in toward Dalton just before the cuffs went on, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Another one playing dress up. You'd think they'd at least learn the rank structure before trying to scam us. Dalton had chuckled nervously, but said nothing in response. Bennett leaned back in his chair, scrubbing through the clip again to make sure he heard it right. The footage left no room for interpretation. Monroe had made up his mind the second he saw her. The camera caught what their conscience didn't. Bennett knew this was bad, real bad, but Rogers had already decided on the official version, and pushing back now would put Bennett in the line of fire. He copied the footage to a private drive, locking it behind his own credentials. If this went nuclear, he might need it. Back outside, Monroe paced along the edge of the scene, shooting quick glances at the crowd. He knew the media was probably en route. He needed something stronger to hold the line. He turned to Dalton. We need a statement. Get ready to back me up. She got aggressive, started raising her voice, right? Tried to pull away. Dalton didn't answer right away. Monroe's voice dropped lower. You saw it. Say you saw it. Dalton shifted uncomfortably, but nodded once, not trusting his voice to betray the lie out loud. But not everyone in the department was willing to stay silent. Inside the station across town, Officer Elijah Reeves sat at his desk staring at the live footage spreading online. He knew that woman. Not personally, but by reputation. She had been featured last year after the flood rescue. He remembered seeing her face on the wall in the break room when the department had posted a list of military personnel to watch for. It wasn't supposed to be a hit list, just awareness training, but everyone knew the list was more about control than safety. Monroe had joked about it more than once, calling it the Stolen Valor Watch List. Reeves had heard enough over the months to know Monroe had a thing about women in uniform, especially black women. Reeves glanced around the empty office before pulling out his phone. His thumb hovered over the encrypted messenger app he used when passing tips to contacts outside the department. This time, it wasn't a reporter he reached out to. He searched through his old messages until he found the number he had kept, just in case the day ever came when someone inside needed to hear the truth. Colonel James Carter. Reeves typed quickly, keeping his message short and anonymous. Monroe has a history. Check internal complaints 14 months ago. 2 similar stops, both buried. One was a Navy vet. Look for report number 11,873. This isn't the first time. It won't be the last if no one stops him. He hit send and locked his phone, sliding it back into his pocket. His pulse quickened, knowing full well the risk he had just taken. But, watching the live feed, seeing that woman sit there in cuffs while Monroe spun lies, Reeves knew he couldn't do nothing. At Fort Granger, Carter stood over the communications desk when his secure line pinged with the encrypted message. He read it twice, his jaw locking tighter with every word. This wasn't just about Mia anymore. This was a pattern, and now he had the proof to dig deeper. He leaned over the comms officer's shoulder. Pull every complaint tied to Officer Kyle Monroe. I want them on my desk in 5 minutes. The comms officer hesitated. Sir, that's local jurisdiction. Carter didn't blink. Not anymore. As the data request went through, Carter knew exactly what was coming next. He was done waiting. It was time to move, and someone had just given him the ammunition he needed to go all the way. Elijah Reeves sat stiff in his chair at Gahanna Police Headquarters, his leg bouncing under the desk as the weight of what he had just done sank deeper into his chest. His eyes kept darting toward the door like someone would come walking in any second, demanding to know who had leaked the message. But no one did. The building was quiet except for the distant hum of radios and the occasional click of keyboards from officers working the early shift. Reeves clenched his jaw, knowing damn well what kind of storm he had just kicked up. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment a year ago when Monroe had pulled a similar stunt on another soldier. That day had been quieter, not as public. A Navy veteran named Anthony Greer had been stopped outside a grocery store in uniform. Monroe claimed Greer had failed to verify his identity. Reeves had been new then, still learning the ropes, standing by as Monroe humiliated the man in front of shoppers and forced him to the ground. Greer had filed a complaint. Reeves had backed it with a statement, but the report had disappeared within weeks, locked away with a note that it was handled internally. Reeves had known better than to ask questions. He needed the job. He needed the paycheck. But watching the same playbook unfold again with Mia Jackson, this time on camera with the whole damn city watching, had pushed him past his limit. He stood and walked toward the department's internal records room, glancing over his shoulder before swiping his badge. The door buzzed open. He slipped inside, moving to the digital archive terminal. He knew exactly where to look. He had memorized the report number. His fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up complaint number 11,873. There it was, buried under a pile of administrative notes, labeled as resolved, with no disciplinary action recorded. Reeves clenched his fists. The file included witness statements, his own, Greer's, and 2 others who had confirmed Monroe had escalated the stop without cause. It was all there, covered up and buried like it never happened. Reeves inserted a blank drive into the port, copied the full report along with Monroe's disciplinary record, and slipped the drive into his pocket. He moved quickly, exiting the records room and heading to the locker room where he knew no cameras could see him. Pulling out his phone again, he opened the encrypted messenger and sent the file directly to Colonel Carter. No name, no explanation, just the evidence. Across town, Carter stood over his desk, his jaw tightening as the file came through. He scanned the contents, reading the timeline, the statements, the resolution that wasn't a resolution at all. His stomach turned. This was systemic. Monroe had done this before, and the department had helped him get away with it. But not this time. Not again. Carter picked up the phone and called Major Reed. She answered on the first ring. "Sir?" Carter's voice was cold and clear. Get Lieutenant Raymond Brooks to the scene now. Tell him to go in uniform, full rank displayed, and tell him not to ask permission." Reed's voice dropped to a whisper. "You sure you want to go that hard?" Carter didn't hesitate. "It's already public. We either show the chain of command has teeth or we show we're part of the same problem. Move." Reed ended the call without another word, grabbing her keys and heading to brief Brooks. Carter turned back to the feed on his screen. The scene at the gas station hadn't cooled down. The crowd was still thick, the chants still rising, phones still rolling. Rachel Kim's face had appeared on one of the live streams. She had arrived. The press was officially on the ground. Monroe didn't know it yet, but his window for controlling the narrative had just slammed shut. At the gas station, Monroe stood with his arms crossed, trying to keep the tension off his face. Dalton shifted beside him, eyes darting between the growing crowd and the flashing lights of the arriving backup units. Monroe could feel control slipping, but he wasn't ready to admit it. Not yet. A ripple moved through the crowd as a black SUV pulled into the lot, parking with deliberate precision. The door opened, and Lieutenant Raymond Brooks stepped out, fully dressed in Army fatigues, his rank and insignia unmistakable. His presence hit the crowd like a lightning bolt. People parted, phones lifted higher, whispers spread faster. Brooks moved with authority, his face unreadable, scanning the scene before locking eyes on Monroe. He didn't wait for permission. He didn't announce his purpose. He just walked straight toward the patrol car like he owned the ground beneath his boots. Monroe stiffened, stepping forward, blocking the path. "This is a police investigation, sir. I'm going to have to ask you to—" Brooks cut him off with a single raised hand, his voice like steel. "Stand down, Officer Monroe." Monroe's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Dalton shifted again, stepping back slightly, his body language folding in on itself. Brooks didn't stop. He walked to the rear door of the patrol car, locking eyes with Mia through the window. He nodded once, slow and deliberate. Mia held his gaze, her body still tense, but her eyes steady. Brooks turned back to face Monroe. "Unlock the door. Now." Monroe hesitated, glancing toward the command unit where Rogers watched from a distance. Rogers didn't move, didn't intervene. Brooks took another step closer, lowering his voice just enough for Monroe to hear. "Do you really want to add obstruction to your record today, officer?" Monroe's face twisted, jaw clenching so tight his teeth might crack. But he moved. Slowly, reluctantly, he unlocked the door. The air shifted again. The crowd leaned in, and Lieutenant Brooks reached for the handle, ready to do what Monroe never had the decency to do. Lieutenant Raymond Brooks reached for the handle of the patrol car with the kind of precision that made every muscle in Monroe's body lock tight. The moment the door cracked open, the crowd surged forward a step, as if gravity itself had shifted. Phones lifted higher. Voices dropped to breathless whispers. Dalton took a half step back, arms still crossed but no longer looking Monroe's way. Brooks crouched slightly, his voice low and steady. "Sergeant Jackson, I'm Lieutenant Brooks. I'm here on behalf of your command. You're not under arrest. You never were." Mia didn't speak. She didn't move. Her jaw stayed tight, her body as rigid as it had been when they first slammed her against the hood. She had learned long ago not to trust any sudden shift in authority. Brooks saw it. He didn't push. He leaned in further, lowering his voice until only she could hear. "Colonel Carter sent me. You're coming with me, not them." He reached into his cargo pocket and pulled out his field knife, flipping the blade open with one clean motion. The cuffs clinked as he slid the blade between the metal and her wrist. With one twist, the lock popped free. He repeated the motion on the other wrist, slipping the cuffs into his own pocket as he stood. Mia slowly rubbed her wrists, the red marks raw and visible under the morning light. Brooks stepped back, turning to face the crowd. raising his voice so every camera and every witness could hear. "This soldier is not under investigation. She has done nothing wrong. What you witnessed here today was a mistake, one that should have never happened. On behalf of the military, I apologize for what you've seen." The words hit like a hammer. The crowd erupted in murmurs and gasps. Some cheered softly, others stood frozen, processing the weight of what had just been admitted in public. Monroe's face twisted into something between rage and disbelief. He took a step forward, but Brooks turned on him before he could speak. "Step back, officer. You've done enough." Monroe swallowed whatever comeback he had brewing, his fists tightening at his sides. Brooks didn't give him another glance. Instead, he turned back to Mia, nodding once. "You're free to go, Sergeant. Your command is en route." But Mia didn't move toward him. She didn't step toward the edge of the crowd. She stood exactly where she was, planted like a tree in the middle of a storm. She rubbed her wrists once more, then let her arms fall to her sides. Her eyes scanned the faces in front of her, the people who had recorded her humiliation, the ones who had whispered about whether she belonged in that uniform, the ones who had doubted and watched and done nothing until Patrice Ellis had dared to speak up. Mia took a slow breath. She wasn't done here. Not yet. Brooks watched her with a flicker of confusion, but something in her posture told him not to interfere. He turned to the officers standing near the command unit and gave a sharp nod. "This scene is closed. She's no longer in your custody. Any further action taken against her will be considered obstruction of military operations." Rogers, still standing frozen by the command unit, didn't argue. He simply turned his back and walked toward his car, leaving Monroe and Dalton standing in the wreckage of their own making. The crowd slowly began to part, leaving a clear view of Mia standing alone beside the cruiser. Some lowered their phones, unsure whether to stay or leave. Others kept filming, sensing there was more to come. Mia's eyes locked on Patrice Ellis, who stood near the front of the crowd, still holding her phone, but no longer recording. Their eyes met, and for the first time since this all started, Mia gave a small nod of acknowledgement. Patrice lowered her phone and placed her hand over her heart, a silent thank you passing between them. Brooks moved closer, his voice lower now. "Sergeant, you don't have to stay here. Your transport is 5 minutes out. You're free to leave." Mia shook her head slightly. "I'm waiting for my CO." Brooks hesitated but nodded. Understood. He stepped back, giving her space. Monroe paced a few feet away, his face red, his mouth tight with words he couldn't afford to say out loud. Dalton stood with his hands on his hips, staring at the ground, knowing his silence had already branded him a coward in the eyes of the crowd. The air hung thick with tension as Mia stood still, her uniform rumpled, her wrists raw, but her back unbroken. She didn't speak to the cameras. She didn't address the crowd. She just stood there, making sure that everyone who had watched her humiliation also watched her refusal to walk away like she had something to hide. She didn't need saving. She needed someone to do their damn job. And finally, someone had. 5 minutes felt like an hour, but she didn't flinch. She stayed exactly where she was, knowing that the next move wasn't hers to make. It belonged to the one man who had been silent until now. The one man who had started this chain of accountability the second she made that call. Mia shifted her weight, eyes narrowing toward the road as a black military SUV pulled into view. Colonel James Carter had arrived. The black SUV came to a stop just beyond the edge of the crowd, its engine barely humming before the passenger door swung open. Colonel James Carter stepped out without a word, his posture as unreadable as ever. His uniform, crisp and pressed, looked like it had been tailored for this exact moment. He didn't adjust his jacket or scan the scene like a man trying to catch up. He already knew exactly what he was walking into. He walked slowly toward Mia, the crowd instinctively pulling back to make a path. All eyes shifted to him, whispers starting again, but this time the phones were strangely steady. Nobody dared to speak as Carter approached. Even Monroe stood frozen, jaw tight, his fists clenched so hard his knuckles paled. Dalton took a step further back, practically retreating to the cruiser. Brooks stood silently off to the side, arms crossed, his face unreadable but clearly ready to intervene if needed. Carter never even glanced at them. His focus was fixed on Mia. He stopped just a few feet in front of her. No words, no breath wasted on what had already been seen. He just stood there, letting the weight of the moment fill the air like concrete. Mia squared her shoulders, meeting his stare without flinching. She didn't salute. She didn't shift her stance to something formal. She just stood there, as if grounded by something deeper than military protocol. The silence stretched longer than anyone watching could bear. Finally, Carter gave a single, sharp nod. Nothing more. No explanation. No performance. Just acknowledgement. Mia exhaled, her voice low but clear enough for the nearest cameras to pick up. "I'm fine. Just mad." Carter's lips pressed into the closest thing to a smile anyone had ever seen from him. He nodded again, slower this time, and turned to Brooks with a slight tilt of his head. Without needing to be told, Brooks moved to coordinate their exit, but Mia didn't move. Not yet. She stood her ground as Carter turned back to face her one last time. The two locked eyes for just a second longer. Then Carter spoke, so quietly only she could hear it. "You stood when they didn't. That's enough." With that, he turned toward the SUV, motioning for Brooks to follow. The crowd watched in tense silence as the military officers returned to the vehicle. Monroe shifted like he wanted to protest, but his voice caught in his throat. He knew better now. The cameras were still rolling. Mia watched them leave but stayed right where she was. She didn't walk away. She didn't retreat into the safety of the vehicle waiting for her. She stayed, shoulders back, chin high. Not for the cameras, not for the crowd, for herself, because they needed to see what accountability looked like when someone refused to disappear after being humiliated. She stood, they watched, and history hit record. In a high school a few blocks away, Ms. Karen Wiley paused her civics lesson as her students scrolled through their phones, murmuring louder than usual for a Monday morning. She walked to the front of the classroom, hands on her hips, watching as more and more students turned their screens toward each other. The video from the gas station had hit every platform by the time she crossed to the computer on her desk. She clicked into the trending feed, her jaw tightening as the footage played across the projector. The classroom went silent as they watched Mia stand there, refusing to move even after the cuffs had been removed. Some students exchanged glances. Others leaned forward, drawn into the gravity of it all. Wiley turned the volume up as the final moment played. Carter's silent nod, Mia's quiet words. The class sat still for a moment, processing what they had just witnessed. Wiley turned to face them, clearing her throat. "All right, let's talk about what you just saw." She crossed her arms, looking at the faces staring back at her. "What does this tell us about power, about perception, about who gets to be believed?" A boy in the front raised his hand slowly. She had everything, the uniform, the ID, and they still didn't believe her. Another student added, but she didn't back down, not once. Wiley nodded, glancing back at the frozen frame on the screen. "Exactly. So here's the question. What's louder? What they say about you or what you refuse to let define you?" The discussion started slow but gained momentum as students unpacked every angle. Race, authority, military service, media bias. Phones buzzed again as more clips, more reactions, more commentary flooded in from across the country. Mia's silent defiance had already become more than just a moment. It was turning into a movement. And while the city tried to figure out how to clean up the mess Monroe had made, The conversation had already started spreading to classrooms, living rooms, and boardrooms far beyond Gahanna. People weren't just watching anymore. They were asking questions. They were connecting dots, and somewhere, in another corner of the city, the ripple effect was only beginning. By noon, the video had crossed state lines. It was no longer just trending in Ohio. Hashtags tied to Mia's name were climbing nationally, flooding social media feeds faster than any press release could keep up with. Every major platform had picked it up. Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, even Facebook groups usually reserved for military families and veterans. Screenshots of Mia standing in front of the patrol car, still in her uniform with the cuffs dangling from Lieutenant Brooks's hand, had become the visual centerpiece for every post, meme, and article, debating what had happened and what it meant. It wasn't just a viral moment anymore. It had become a national conversation. In high school classrooms like the one at East Gahanna High, teachers scrapped their lesson plans. Karen Wiley wasn't the only educator using the footage as a real-time civics case study. Students debated the balance of power between local law enforcement and military authority. They questioned why verified identification hadn't been enough. Some challenged each other over whether the officers had done anything wrong at all. But every student watched the same clip, the same silent stand Mia had taken, and none of them could deny the tension that hung in the air long after the video ended. "She didn't even say much," one student said, leaning back in his chair. "She just stood there." Wiley nodded. "And sometimes that's louder than anything you could say." Across town at the Columbus Community Center, a group of local veterans gathered in their usual circle, the TV in the corner looping the story on the local news. The headline at the bottom of the screen read, "Sergeant Detained. Police Under Fire." One of the veterans, a retired Marine named Greg Walters, leaned forward in his seat, shaking his head. "You'd think they'd learn by now. You don't touch someone in uniform without damn good reason." Beside him, a Vietnam veteran named Paul whispered, "She stood there like she'd done it 100 times before. Made those officers look small just by standing still." An Army widow named Carol, who had stayed quiet most of the morning, finally spoke. "It's not just about her uniform. It's about the fact they saw her as a threat before they saw her as a soldier. That's what's eating people alive right now." Greg nodded grimly. "Yeah, she didn't teach with words. She taught by not backing down." The veteran sat in silence for a moment before Carol stood and walked over to the whiteboard on the far wall. She picked up a marker and wrote 3 words in bold letters: "Stand, record, remember." The community center wasn't the only place feeling the ripple effect. City council members had already begun receiving calls and emails demanding a public hearing. Churches, barber shops, and coffee houses were buzzing with arguments and outrage, some siding with law enforcement, others furious over the treatment of a decorated soldier. Local podcasts went live with emergency episodes, pulling in civil rights attorneys, military advocates, and community leaders to weigh in. One popular live stream titled "Uniform or Skin? What Did They See First?" had already racked up over 50,000 views by the time lunch hours rolled around. Meanwhile, in a university lecture hall in downtown Columbus, Professor Linda Herrera paused her class on constitutional law to stream the footage. She let it play twice before turning to face her students. "What you just saw," she said, "is why the Fourth Amendment exists. But here's the question you need to wrestle with. Who actually gets to benefit from it? Who gets to be protected by it?" One student in the back raised his hand. Technically, she was already protected. She had ID, orders, witnesses. None of that stopped them. Linda nodded. "Exactly. So let's talk about why." The classroom exploded into discussion, students leaning forward, their voices climbing over each other as they debated intent, bias, and the limits of power when the public was watching. And the public was definitely watching. Local radio stations opened their phone lines. Callers flooded in, sharing their own stories of being profiled, humiliated, or silenced. Military families called in, some in tears, others furious, all pointing to the same question. How many more times would it take before someone in authority actually paid for getting it wrong? By the time the afternoon city council session began, the public comment list was already maxed out. Residents packed the chamber, holding printed screenshots of Mia's face on poster boards. The tension in the room was electric. The council members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, knowing the cameras rolling in the back of the room were broadcasting every twitch, every word, every misstep. One speaker after another took the mic, their voices shaking with emotion. Some called for police reform. Others demanded Monroe and Dalton be fired on the spot. One older woman, dressed in a faded navy jacket, stood with tears in her eyes as she whispered into the microphone, "You don't treat soldiers like that. You don't treat people like that. Not in this city." While the community erupted in conversation, the Gahanna Police Department was locking its doors. Inside the headquarters, Rogers paced the floor of the Internal Affairs conference room. His phone buzzed on the table for the third time in 5 minutes. It was the mayor's office again, demanding a status update. He ignored it. He turned to Bennett, whose face looked grimmer by the minute. "Where the hell are they?" Rogers barked. Bennett didn't answer. He was already watching Monroe and Dalton walking toward the building, summoned to face internal review. Rogers slammed his palm on the table. "Get them in here now." And just like that, the weight of the city's outrage shifted from the streets to the department's closed-door meeting room. The conference room inside Gahanna Police Headquarters felt like a tomb. The blinds were shut, the fluorescent lights overhead flickered faintly, and the air hung heavy with the weight of something irreversible. Rogers stood at the head of the table, face hard, arms crossed, staring down Monroe and Dalton like he was looking through them, not at them. Bennett sat off to the side, lips pressed into a thin line, a sealed folder resting in front of him. Monroe leaned back in his chair, trying to look relaxed, but his foot tapped uncontrollably against the floor. Dalton sat stiffly, jaw clenched, eyes locked on the table, as if looking up might set the room on fire. Rogers didn't bother with pleasantries. He didn't ask for their side. He already knew it. So did everyone else. He slid the sealed folder across the table, stopping it in front of Monroe with a single push. "You know what's in there," Rogers said flatly. Monroe didn't move. Rogers leaned forward, voice lower but sharper. "Do you have anything you want to say before I make this official?" Monroe finally leaned in, pressing both palms on the table like he was preparing to argue, but nothing came out. His mouth opened, then closed again. Dalton shifted slightly, but kept his head down. Rogers waited, giving them the chance to offer some defense, some apology, some acknowledgement that they understood the scale of what they had done. Neither spoke. Bennett finally broke the silence, opening another file and sliding 2 official suspension notices across the table. Effective immediately. You are both suspended without pay, pending termination review. Your actions this morning violated department protocols, civil rights policies, and state-level military protection statutes. Monroe's jaw twitched. "We followed procedure," he muttered under his breath. Rogers slammed his palm on the table so hard both men flinched. "Don't you dare sit there and lie to me. Not after what's on those body cam recordings. Not after you humiliated a verified soldier in uniform. Not after you embarrassed this entire department in front of the country." Dalton finally spoke, voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't cuff her. He did." Bennett turned sharply toward Dalton. "And you stood there and let him. You didn't stop it. You didn't speak up. You didn't do a damn thing." Monroe leaned back again, smirking like he had already accepted the fall. "We're just the ones who got caught on camera." Rogers pointed a finger in his face. No, Monroe. You're the ones who thought a badge made you untouchable, but not this time. Monroe's face darkened, but he stayed silent. Bennett leaned back, folding his arms. You've got 24 hours to turn in your badges, your gear, and clean out your lockers. After that, the city council will decide if criminal charges follow. Dalton rubbed his face with both hands, finally looking up. What about the statement? What about the official narrative? Rogers shook his head, disgust curling in his throat. There is no narrative anymore. The world already saw what you did. We don't get to spin this. You're done. Monroe stood abruptly, knocking the chair backward. He didn't bother to pick it up. He grabbed the suspension notice, crumpled it in his fist, and stormed out of the room without another word. Dalton followed, slower, dragging his feet like the floor had turned to mud. The door slammed behind them, leaving Rogers and Bennett in silence. Rogers let out a slow breath, running a hand over his face. Get the press office ready. We're going to have to face this sooner than later. Bennett nodded, gathering the remaining paperwork. What about the mayor? Rogers laughed bitterly. He's already throwing us under the bus. Let him. We earned it. Across town, Mia sat in her small living room, the television off, her phone silenced. The world outside had turned her name into a headline, but inside these four walls, everything felt muted. She stared at the floor, replaying every second of that morning in her mind. The cuffs, the cameras, the faces in the crowd, Carter's silent nod. The offer to speak to the press had come almost immediately after she left the scene. Reporters had camped outside her building. Her phone had buzzed nonstop with requests for interviews, statements, sound bites. She had turned them all down. She didn't need the noise. She didn't need the spotlight. She needed the silence. The knock on her door came soft but steady. Mia stood slowly, peeking through the curtain to see a familiar face waiting on the other side. Greg Walters, the Marine vet from the community center. He held a small envelope in his hand. Mia opened the door without a word. Greg offered a small nod. We're holding a gathering tonight at the VFW in Reynoldsburg. Just a few of us. Some people who've been watching what you've done. Mia didn't answer. Greg extended the envelope. No press. No cameras. Just us. Mia took the envelope but stayed quiet. Greg shifted on his feet. You don't owe anyone a speech. You already said everything that mattered when you stood there and didn't move. But if you feel like sitting with some people who understand exactly what that cost you, we'd be honored to have you. Mia finally nodded, clutching the envelope tighter in her hand. She didn't know what she was walking into, but for once, she didn't feel like she had to do it alone. The VFW post in Reynoldsburg looked the same as every other small-town veteran hall Mia had ever been in. Faded flags hung on the walls, plaques lined up in neat rows listing names most people would never remember, and a scattering of folding chairs surrounded plastic tables that had seen decades of coffee, cards, and quiet conversations no one outside these walls would ever hear. Mia stood in the doorway for a moment, gripping the small envelope Greg had handed her. She had almost turned around twice on the drive over, unsure if she was ready to face anyone, even the people who claimed they understood. But something about the silence of her apartment had felt heavier than any room full of strangers could. So she had come. Not for them. For herself. Inside, the room had maybe 20 people scattered in small groups. Some wore old uniforms, jackets from wars long past. Others wore simple street clothes, but the way they carried themselves told Mia they had served. They all had. The conversations dipped as she entered, not out of awkwardness, but out of quiet acknowledgement. Greg was the first to approach. He nodded once and gestured toward an empty seat near the front. Mia moved slowly, not quite sure if she was supposed to sit or stand. An older woman with silver hair and a navy pin on her collar stood and cleared her throat. We all know why she's here. We've all seen the footage. But tonight isn't about the cameras. It's not about the headlines. It's about us." Mia shifted in her seat, feeling every eye turn toward her. Greg leaned over and whispered, "Only if you want to. No pressure." Mia took a breath, steadying herself before standing. She didn't prepare a speech. She didn't clear her throat or thank them for having her. She just spoke, low and plain. "I didn't want to go viral," she started, her voice steady but tired. "I didn't want to be a headline or a hashtag. I just wanted to be treated like I mattered, like putting on this uniform meant something to the people who are supposed to protect us all the same." No one interrupted. No one shifted uncomfortably. They just listened. Mia let the silence hang for a moment before finishing. "I don't want applause. I want change." A low murmur of agreement rippled through the room. No one clapped. No one stood up to offer some motivational response. They knew better. They had lived enough of these moments to understand that change didn't come from one speech in one room. It came from what people did after the room emptied. An older man with thick glasses stood next, his voice shaking slightly. "I served in '68, got spit on when I came home. They called me a traitor in my own country. I swore I'd never let that happen to someone else, but I watched them do it to you. Not with spit, but with their silence. And I sat in my chair and let them. I won't make that mistake again." More heads nodded. The room felt heavier but clearer somehow. No one tried to make Mia feel like a hero. No one tried to tell her she had inspired them. They knew that wasn't what she needed. Instead, they started talking. Not about her, but about what needed to change. About the unchecked power of local law enforcement. About how military service didn't erase the way people saw you first by your skin. About the quiet ways communities let it happen again and again. Mia sat back down, listening as the room filled with stories of other times, other places, other names that never made it to the news. It wasn't loud, it wasn't organized, but it was real. The meeting lasted for hours, the coffee going cold on the side table, the overhead lights buzzing faintly as one by one the veterans stood and shared what they had carried for too long. Mia didn't speak again, but she didn't have to. They had heard what mattered. When the night finally wound down, Greg walked her to the door. He didn't offer advice or platitudes. He just handed her a small card with a phone number on it. "If you ever want to sit in again," he said simply. Mia nodded, sliding the card into her jacket pocket. She stepped out into the cool night air, breathing in the kind of quiet that didn't feel heavy this time. Back across town, while most people slept or scrolled through the endless commentary online, a quiet meeting was happening behind closed doors at City Hall. No press was called, no statements were drafted, but the city's legal team was already pushing through new policy revisions aimed at strengthening oversight on police interactions with military personnel. Language was drafted, recommendations were written. A memo marked "urgent" was slid across the mayor's desk before midnight. But policy didn't stop whispers. It didn't erase the looks Mia had gotten when she walked into the grocery store earlier that day. It didn't stop the strangers who stared a little too long or the ones who avoided her altogether. It didn't change the fact that for every comment online demanding justice, there were 10 more accusing her of faking, of playing the race card, of setting up the officers to fail. The ink on the city's new policy hadn't even dried, and already Mia knew this wasn't over. The first time, Mia noticed it was at the grocery store. She had gone early, long before the usual Saturday rush, hoping to get in and out without having to navigate the weight of recognition. But even at 7 a.m., the whispers found her. She was standing in front of the cereal aisle, comparing 2 boxes, when she felt the silence thicken around her. She didn't have to turn around to know someone had recognized her. A couple stood at the end of the aisle, their shopping cart frozen in place, both whispering under their breath while stealing glances like they were afraid to make eye contact. Mia kept her back to them, choosing the cheaper box, and moved on without saying a word. She caught it again in the checkout line. An older man in a baseball cap leaned toward the cashier, whispering something with a slight smirk as his eyes flicked toward Mia. The cashier's expression tightened, her smile slipping for just a second before she forced it back into place. Mia felt the tension crawl up the back of her neck, but didn't flinch. She paid, grabbed her bag, and left without looking back. On the walk to her car, a woman in a church dress held the door open a little longer than necessary, her eyes scanning Mia's face before offering a tight nod that didn't feel kind or welcoming. Mia nodded back, not because she wanted to, but because it was easier than standing there frozen under another stranger's stare. It was everywhere now. On the sidewalks, people glanced twice when they passed her. Some smiled softly like they wanted to say thank you but didn't know how. Others narrowed their eyes, tightening their lips like she was something they had to tolerate, not someone they respected. It was loud in a way only silence could be. She felt it at church the next morning. She had almost skipped, knowing the whispers would follow her there too, but habit dragged her through the doors anyway. The pastor paused mid-sermon to make a vague comment about courage and justice, never saying her name, but letting the weight of his words hang in the air long enough for every head in the room to turn toward her. Some people nodded at her after the service, offering polite half-smiles. A few avoided her entirely, turning their shoulders as she passed. Mia left before the coffee hour began, slipping out the side door and walking the long way home. At the local farmer's market the following week, it happened again. She was reaching for a basket of apples when a woman whispered loud enough for her friend to hear, "That's the soldier from the video. The one who made those officers lose their jobs." Mia stiffened, letting her hand hover over the fruit before slowly pulling back. She moved to another stand, but the feeling followed her like a shadow. She knew what they were saying without hearing every word. To some, she was a hero. To others, a disruption. She walked anyway. She started noticing people filming her again, but this time it wasn't loud or obvious. It was quick glances, phones tilted just enough to capture her without her knowing. Except she always knew. A man at the post office held his phone low near his waist, pretending to scroll, but angling the camera toward her. A teenager on the city bus snapped a picture as she stepped off, the flash catching her eye even in the daylight. And every night when she finally locked her door behind her, she wondered how long it would last. How long she would have to carry this version of herself, the woman the internet had turned into a symbol she never asked to be. She stopped checking her notifications, stopped reading the articles, stopped watching the clips that never seemed to stop looping. But the noise outside never really faded. It just changed shape. One night, after another long day of avoiding stares that felt heavier than words, Mia came home to find a small envelope wedged in the crack of her apartment door. It wasn't stamped or addressed, just plain white paper, sealed with a single piece of tape. She stood in the hallway for a long minute, staring at it like it might explode in her hand. She almost threw it away without opening it, but something about the handwriting on the front stopped her. It was shaky, almost too light to read, but there it was, her name written in small, careful letters. Mia peeled the tape back and unfolded the note. It wasn't typed. It wasn't from a news outlet or a lawyer or a stranger demanding answers. It was written in blue ink on lined notebook paper. "I didn't think I belonged until I saw you stand." The words hit harder than anything else had in weeks. No signature, no explanation, just that single line. Mia read it twice, then a third time, gripping the paper like it might fall apart if she let go. She pressed it to her chest, closing her eyes for the first time in what felt like days without feeling like the world was closing in. She didn't know who had written it. She didn't need to. For the first time since the cuffs had come off, Mia felt something stronger than anger or exhaustion. She felt understood, and that changed everything. Mia sat on the edge of her couch, staring at the folded letter resting on the coffee table in front of her. The room was dim, the last traces of sunlight filtering through the blinds as evening pressed against the windows. The words, written in shaky blue ink, still echoed in her mind. She had read them over and over again until they felt carved into her memory. I didn't think I belonged until I saw you stand. She didn't know who had left it, but the weight of it hit harder than anything else had in the days since her life had been split open for the world to see. She had spent every moment since the cuffs were removed trying to move quietly, trying not to draw attention, trying to convince herself she didn't owe anyone anything. But this letter made that harder. It wasn't the press. It wasn't the crowd. It wasn't the people who had called her a problem or accused her of starting something she had never asked for. It was someone who had been watching silently. Someone who had seen more than just the headlines. Someone who had needed to see her stand. She picked the letter up again, studying the handwriting. There was no name, no address, no way to know where it had come from. But something told her it wasn't from a stranger. Not really. She leaned back, closing her eyes, trying to place the words, the tone. Something about it felt familiar, like someone speaking from a place she knew all too well. Mia stood and moved toward her small desk by the window, pulling out an old training roster from the stack of paperwork she kept from her reserve unit. She flipped through the names until she found the one that had been scratching at the edge of her memory all night. Darla Reynolds, 19 years old, the youngest recruit in her training group last year. Mia remembered her now, quiet, nervous, always hovering at the back of the formation like she was waiting for someone to tell her she didn't belong. Mia had only spoken to her once, a passing comment after a drill when she had noticed the girl struggling to keep pace. Keep pushing. You earned that uniform. She hadn't thought about it again until now. Mia reached for her phone, scrolling through old messages until she found Darla's number. She hovered over the call button for a long moment, but didn't press it. Instead, she grabbed her jacket and the letter and headed for the door. She needed to see it for herself. The place where everything had started. The place where she had been torn apart in front of strangers and stitched back together by a single act of defiance. She needed to see if it still held the same weight or if she had left something there she needed to reclaim. The sun had just dipped below the horizon by the time Mia pulled into the gas station parking lot. It was quiet now, the pumps mostly empty, the lot lit by the soft glow of overhead lights buzzing faintly in the evening air. She parked in the same spot as before, engine idling for a moment before she shut it off. She sat there, gripping the letter in her lap, staring out the windshield at the place that had become the center of a storm she never wanted. Taking a deep breath, she stepped out of the car and stood there for a moment, letting the quiet settle around her. There were no cameras this time, no phones held high, no officers waiting to question her presence. Just the soft hum of the streetlights and the distant sound of a car passing on the main road. Mia walked slowly toward the pump, her boots crunching softly against the pavement. She reached out, brushing her fingers across the metal like she was touching something fragile, something she wasn't sure she was ready to face again, but it didn't feel the same. The weight wasn't as heavy. The air didn't press against her chest like it had that morning. She turned toward the station building and noticed a young man leaning against the wall near the entrance, watching her with curious eyes. He didn't reach for his phone. He didn't whisper. He just nodded once, a small gesture of acknowledgement. Mia nodded back, surprised by how different it felt this time. Inside the store, the cashier looked up and met her eyes without flinching, offering a small smile. "Good evening," she said softly, like she was trying not to startle her. Mia nodded again, grabbing a bottle of water from the cooler and heading to the counter. The cashier rang it up quickly, her hands steady. As Mia handed over the cash, the woman hesitated for just a second before speaking again. "I saw what happened," she said quietly. "I'm glad you came back." Mia didn't know how to respond, so she simply nodded once more and took her change. She stepped back outside, the air cooler now as night fully settled over the lot. She stood there for a moment, looking around, realizing that for the first time since that day, no one was treating her like she was the problem. No whispers, no stares, just a quiet that felt almost like respect. She unfolded the letter one more time, reading the words again, feeling their weight settle in her chest. She didn't want to lead, but someone had followed, and maybe that was reason enough to keep standing. It had been a month since the storm broke, a month since the videos stopped trending, the headlines moved on, and the cameras turned their attention to the next outrage. But for Mia Jackson, it didn't feel like anything had really ended. It had just quieted. The kind of quiet that wasn't heavy this time, the kind of quiet that felt earned. She had avoided the gas station since that day, not because she was afraid, but because she didn't want to turn it into something it wasn't. It wasn't a monument. It wasn't sacred ground. It was just a place she happened to be when the world decided to watch. Still, something had pulled her back. So, on a Saturday morning, just like any other, Mia pulled into that same station, driving a different car this time, dressed in jeans and a simple sweatshirt. No uniform, no rank, just Mia. She stepped out, swiped her card, and grabbed the pump. For a moment she stood there, glancing around, half expecting to feel the weight of eyes on her again, but the lot was quiet. A couple filled their truck at the far end. A man cleaned his windshield across the lane. No one stared, no one whispered. As the tank filled, a middle-aged woman stepped out of the store, paused when she saw Mia, and gave the smallest of nods. Not dramatic, not performative, just acknowledgement. Mia nodded back, letting the moment pass without holding on to it. She replaced the nozzle, grabbed her receipt, and headed back to her car. Justice isn't loud. Sometimes it's just not being interrupted anymore. She drove home that day without feeling like she had to explain herself to anyone. No cameras, no headlines, just a quiet return to something that felt like normal. But Mia knew she couldn't go back to being invisible. Not after what had happened. Not after the letter. So she found a different way to show up. It started small. An email to her unit offering to host a private session for new recruits about handling public encounters in uniform. No press, no official memo, just a quiet space to talk about what no one ever prepares you for. The stares, the doubts, the moments when the uniform feels like both armor and a target. The invitation spread faster than she expected. First, it was a handful of young soldiers sitting in a circle at the back of the base conference room. Then, it was 24. Then, a waiting list. Mia didn't stand at a podium. She didn't lecture. She sat with them on their level, telling the truth about what it felt like to stand there with cuffs digging into her skin, knowing she had done everything right and still wasn't believed. She didn't tell them to fight louder. She didn't tell them to argue. She taught them how to stand, how to hold their ground without letting anger break them, how to recognize that sometimes the loudest statement is refusing to back down. She taught them that dignity isn't something anyone gives you. It's something you decide to keep for yourself. She wrote follow-up emails after every session, sharing tips on de-escalation, legal resources, and, most importantly, reminding them that the uniform wasn't what gave them worth. They carried that on their own, whether anyone acknowledged it or not. Word spread beyond her unit. Other bases reached out. Community groups asked if she would speak. Mia kept it small, choosing the quiet rooms over the big stages, knowing the impact wasn't in the applause, but in the moments no one else saw. One night, after finishing another session with a group of new recruits, Mia sat alone at her desk, typing the closing lines of the message she had come to send to every group. Her fingers hovered for a moment before she typed the words she had learned to carry like a mission statement. She didn't raise her voice. She raised the standard. She leaned back, staring at the sentence for a moment before adding one more line. The question that had stayed with her from the moment it all began. What would you do if you saw injustice in uniform? Walk past or walk through it? She hit send, closed her laptop, and stood up because she already knew the answer. This wasn't a story about going viral. It wasn't a story about headlines, hashtags, or breaking the internet. It was a story about what happens when someone refuses to shrink in the face of humiliation, when standing still becomes the loudest protest of all. Mia Jackson didn't ask for cameras. She didn't ask for attention, and she certainly didn't ask to be made an example. But when it happened, she didn't flinch. She didn't perform. She stood, calm, steady, and unshaken. And in that stillness, someone watched. Someone followed, and the ripple kept moving. Maybe you've never stood in a uniform. Maybe you've never faced cuffs for doing nothing wrong. But the question remains, for all of us, what would you do if you saw injustice in plain sight? Would you walk past, or would you walk through it? If this story moved you, if it made you think, we invite you to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that challenge, inspire, and spark the conversations that matter.